For 10,000 years, the galaxy ran from the dark. Then humans looked into it and smiled.
The HFY consensus had a word for the deep places between stars. Dark. It did not simply mean darkness. In the old tongue, before the consensus had ships or fire or even written language, Dark meant the place where things older than gods came to feed. It was a word born from racial memory, from a time when the ancestors of the HFY had huddled in shallow caves on a dying moon, listening to something enormous move through the atmosphere above them. Something that did not breathe. Something that did not stop. They never named what it was. They didn't dare. By the time humanity made first contact with the HFY consensus, that ancient terror had evolved into something more sophisticated, a galaxy-wide treaty of silence. 47 spacefaring civilizations, spanning 6 star clusters and 11,000 years of collective history, all sharing one unspoken agreement. You do not go to certain places. You do not transmit into certain frequencies. You do not linger too long in the dark between stars. And above all else, you do not wake what sleeps in the Veil Nebula. Ambassador Suraketh, third daughter of the High Consensus and a diplomat of 40 years' experience, had met hundreds of alien species in her career. She had negotiated with the crystalline Phoros, whose communication was entirely chemical. She had brokered peace with the Dren Collective, a species that experienced time in a non-linear fashion and often apologized for things they hadn't done yet. But she had never met humans. She sat across a polished obsidian table from the human delegation and studied them with all 6 of her sensory nodes fully extended. They looked soft, absurdly, dangerously soft. No carapace, no secondary skeleton. Their skin, pink and brown and dark gold, sat directly over their muscle tissue with almost nothing protecting it. Their eyes were fixed in their skulls, limited to a narrow forward cone of vision. They had 2 arms. 2. And yet, they were smiling. Ambassador Suraketh, said the lead human, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, extending one of her soft, unprotected hand across the table. It's an honor. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. Suraketh had reviewed the translated gesture. A handshake, physical contact as a greeting. Among the HFY, physical contact with a stranger was an act of either profound trust or provocation. She had been briefed that, for humans, it was simply hello. She reached out slowly and clasped the human's hand. It was warm, bizarrely, unsettlingly warm. The consensus welcomes you, Suraketh said carefully through the translation module at her throat. There are matters we must discuss before your civilization proceeds further into the outer sectors. Elena Vasquez nodded, still wearing that smile like armor. The briefing took 4 hours. Suraketh's senior advisor, a cartographer named Veil Nebula, laid out the known boundaries of what the consensus called the Forbidden Geometries, a constellation of regions throughout the galaxy that 47 civilizations had agreed, through hard experience and harder loss, to never approach. The Shattered Corridor, the Silence of Makreth, the 3 dead systems around the Helix Anomaly, where entire fleets had disappeared without a single distress signal. Each region was marked on the holographic map in deep red, and at the center of them all, the Veil Nebula, pulsing softly on the display, beautiful and enormous and wrong in a way that made Suraketh's secondary nervous system clench every time she looked at it. "What are these symbols?" asked one of the human delegates, a young man named Commander Tomas Reyes. He was pointing at the ancient HFY script that bordered each red zone on the map. Veldras translated without inflection. He had learned not to show emotion when reciting the old warnings. They say, "Here waits a hunger older than stars. Do not knock. Do not answer. Do not remember that you came." A silence settled over the room. The humans looked at each other. And then, "God help them," Commander Reyes said. "What's actually in the Veil Nebula? Has anyone ever looked?" The entire HFY delegation went rigid. Suraketh stared at him. "We know what is in the Veil Nebula," she said very quietly, "because one of our predecessor civilizations sent a probe 3,000 years ago. The probe returned 9 months later. It had been modified. Its transmissions lasted for approximately 6 hours before the consensus destroyed the signal relays. What was it transmitting? Screaming, said Veldras, and the word fell into the room like a stone into still water. The probe had no vocal apparatus. It should not have been capable of screaming. We have never been able to explain it, and we have never tried again. Another silence. This one longer. Then Elena Vasquez leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked the question that would change everything. Can we see the transmission recordings? 3 months later, Suraketh received a communication from the Human Deep Space Division that made every sensory node on her body stand at full alert. We're sending a manned expedition to the Veil Nebula. We'd love to have a consensus observer aboard if you're willing. She read it 4 times. Then she cummed Veldras. They're going, she said. A long pause from his end. To the Veil. To the Veil. They've heard the probe recordings? They've heard them, yes. Another pause. Even longer. Ambassador, Veldras said carefully. Do they understand what they heard? Suraketh thought about Elena Vasquez's face when they had played the recordings in a sealed analysis chamber 3 weeks prior. She thought about how the sound had filled the room, that impossible mechanical screaming, layered and wrong, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost like language. She thought about how every HFY technician in the room had needed immediate psychological support afterward. She thought about how Elena Vasquez had listened to all 6 hours with a recorder in her hand and a notebook on her knee, occasionally whispering fascinating under her breath. I don't think understand is the right word, Suraketh said finally. But they're going anyway. She paused. I'm going with them. The human ship was called the Persistent Question. Suraketh suspected the name was intentional. She had been assigned her own quarters, modest by human standards, which meant enormous by HFY ones, and spent the first 3 days of their journey watching the crew through careful observation. She was cataloging data. That was what she told herself. In truth, she was trying to understand them. They were strange in ways her briefings had not prepared her for. They exercised obsessively, running on mechanical tracks going nowhere for hours at a time, as though their biology required the simulation of being chased. They gathered in their communal spaces and made loud, barking sounds at each other that her translator identified as laughter, a stress relief mechanism tied to social bonding. They slept deeply and without apparent anxiety, even as the ship crossed the boundary markers the consensus had placed at the edge of the outer dark. On the 4th day, she found Commander Reyes sitting alone in the observation bay, staring into the void. You should be sleeping, she said, for lack of anything better. Can't, he said, not looking away from the stars. We're getting close to the shattered corridor. I wanted to see it. Suraketh sat beside him. Another human gesture she had adopted, this proximity during conversation. You know what happened in the corridor. 12 Phoros colony ships. 30,000 people. He nodded slowly. Disappeared in 40 minutes. No debris. No signals. You know this, and you're looking toward it. He finally glanced at her. In the starlight, his eyes caught the reflection of distant suns. My grandfather was a deep-sea diver, he said. On Earth, he used to go down to places where the pressure would kill most things. Dark places. Cold places. Places where the things that lived there were so alien you could barely process them with human eyes. He paused. He told me once that the deep ocean doesn't care if you're afraid of it. It's just there. The fear is yours. What you do with it, that's yours too. Suraketh considered this for a long moment. Among the HFY, she said slowly, there's an old proverb. The wise creature lives long. The brave creature changes things. We have always believed that living long was the greater achievement. Reyes looked back out at the stars. How's that working out? Suraketh had no answer for that. They reached the Veil Nebula on the 17th day. It was from the outside, heartbreakingly beautiful. Columns of rose-gold gas 10 light-years tall, threaded through with veins of deep violet plasma. Newborn stars flickered in its depths like embers in smoke. Every instrument on the Persistent Question immediately began registering anomalies, gravitational fluctuations that followed no known pattern, electromagnetic pulses on frequencies the consensus had classified and sealed. And then the signal found them. It came through every system simultaneously, not as sound, as sensation. Suraketh felt it in her secondary nervous system like a cold hand pressed flat against her back. Around her, she heard the human crew react, sharp intakes of breath, someone muttering a word her translator flagged as a religious invocation. But no one ran. No one screamed. Elena Vasquez, standing at the central console with her hands moving across the controls with terrifying calm, said, "It's trying to communicate. It is trying to frighten us," Suraketh said. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to order a retreat. This is how it begins. This is what happened to the probe. The probe didn't talk back, Elena said. Suraketh stared at her. "You cannot be suggesting." "I'm suggesting we say hello." She glanced over her shoulder, and there was that smile again. That impossible smile. It's been alone in there for a very long time. Whatever it is. What followed was 6 hours that Suraketh would spend the rest of her life trying to find the right words to describe. Elena Vasquez spoke to the thing in the Veil Nebula. Not with fear, not with weapons, not with the careful, placating silence that 47 civilizations had offered it for 10,000 years. She spoke to it the way Commander Reyes's grandfather must have spoken to the crushing dark of the deep ocean, with direct, unafraid curiosity. She asked the questions. She answered its pulses of sensation with mathematical patterns, with music broadcasts, with the entire recorded history of human civilization compressed into signal form. She treated it not like a monster. She treated it like something that might possibly be lonely, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the thing in the Veil Nebula began to answer. Not in screaming, not in the terrible modified transmissions that had broken the consensus's probe. It answered in patterns, in structures, in something that the ship's AI, working at maximum capacity, began to tentatively, cautiously categorize as language. When it was over, Elena Vasquez sat down heavily in her chair and let out a long, shaking breath. For the first time since Suraketh had met her, she looked tired. "Well," she said quietly. "What did it say?" Reyes asked from directly behind Suraketh's shoulder. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's been there for approximately 12,000 years. It's not a predator. It's not a god." She paused. "It's a refugee. It fled something further out beyond the outer rim. Something that consumed its entire civilization. It came here because the inner galaxy was too bright and crowded for whatever was chasing it to follow." She looked up at the rest of them. "It's been screaming because it didn't know how to ask for help in any way we could hear." The silence that followed was the longest Suraketh had ever lived through. Then, very quietly, she said, "The consensus has been avoiding it for 10,000 years because we thought it was the monster." "Yeah," Elena said softly. "A lot of things look like monsters when they're scared and you don't speak the language." Shooting Star Epilogue. The treaty between the Kethvar consensus and the being the humans, named the Keeper of the Veil, was ratified 14 months later, signed by representatives of all 47 spacefaring civilizations. It was the humans who drafted the treaty language, the humans who had insisted on it, the humans who had looked into the screaming dark and heard, beneath the terror, something that was simply asking. Suraketh stood at the signing ceremony and watched Elena Vasquez accept the gratitude of 47 ambassadors with the same calm, slightly puzzled expression she always wore when people made a large fuss over something she considered obvious. Later, when the ceremony was done and the halls had emptied, Suraketh found her standing alone at a viewport, looking out at the stars. "I've been trying to understand your species," Suraketh said, coming to stand beside her. "For almost 2 years now, I have been cataloging data, trying to find the pattern." Elena glanced at her. "Any luck?" "Some." Suraketh was quiet for a moment. "You're not fearless. I was wrong to think that. Commander Reyes is afraid of the dark. I have seen it. 3 of your crew members required counseling after the Veil encounter. You feel fear the same as any species." She paused. "But fear does not stop you. It does not even slow you. You feel it, and you proceed, and I cannot find, in all of my research, a satisfying explanation for why. Elena smiled, that quiet, impossible smile. My grandmother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something else matters more. She looked back out at the stars, at the rose-gold glow of the Veil Nebula just barely visible at the edge of the viewport. Somewhere inside it, something ancient and immeasurably large was, for the first time in 12,000 years, not alone. We've been afraid since the first time one of us stood at the mouth of a cave and looked out into the dark, Elena said softly. We've always been afraid. We just never stopped walking forward. Suraketh stood beside her and looked out at the same stars. For the first time in her long diplomatic career, in all her years of careful, measured, wise survival, she felt something she had no word for in the Kethvar tongue. The human translator offered her one. Hope. For 10,000 years, the galaxy ran from the dark. Then the humans arrived, and the dark was never the same again.